Tokyo, December 7, 1941, 200 hours Japan Standard Time. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku stood alone on the bridge of the battleship Nagato anchored in Hiroshima Bay, reading the latest intelligence report from Washington that confirmed American Pacific Fleet carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor, though this concerned him less than what he had told the Naval General Staff 6 months earlier, when he warned that he could run wild for 6 months to a year. But after that, he had no expectation of success. A prophecy that would prove devastatingly accurate as American industrial might transformed from producing one aircraft carrier every 2 years to launching one every month, from manufacturing 2,000 aircraft annually to producing 96,000 in a single year, from a peacetime army smaller than Portugal's to a mechanized force of 12 million that would systematically destroy everything Japan had built over decades of conquest. The Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific with 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and over 400 aircraft, was already 230 miles north of Oahu, racing through heavy seas toward a dawn that would live in infamy. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commanding the strike force, had spent the previous evening reviewing American fleet dispositions with his staff officers, particularly Commander Genda Minoru, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack plan, who had studied briefly in America and returned to Japan, convinced that Americans were too obsessed with material comfort and individual freedom to ever match the warrior spirit of Yamato Damashi that had driven Japanese soldiers to choose death over dishonor for 1,000 years. At the Imperial Army headquarters in Tokyo, General Tojo Hideki, who had become Prime Minister just 6 weeks earlier, was meeting with his war cabinet, including General Sugiyama Gen, Chief of the Army General Staff, who had assured the Emperor that the China incident would be resolved in 3 months back in 1937, yet here they were 4 years later with 1 million Japanese soldiers still bogged down in China, while preparing to take on the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands simultaneously. The generals around the table shared intelligence assessments describing a nation torn by isolationism, with the America First Committee drawing massive crowds and Congress having extended selective service by only a single vote in August 1941, just 203 to 202 in the House of Representatives. The Japanese military elite had spent years studying American society through a lens warped by racial theories and cultural misunderstanding, with the Army's training materials describing Americans as lacking the spiritual strength that enabled Japanese soldiers to fight on minimal rations while enduring extreme hardship. Lieutenant Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, the staff officer who planned the Malayan campaign, had written extensively about perceived American psychological weakness, noting the poor performance of American volunteer forces in China and predicting that colonial forces would collapse quickly when faced with determined Japanese attacks. The fundamental miscalculation began with the Tripartite Pact signed with Germany and Italy in September 1940, when Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke assured the Imperial Conference that this alliance would deter American intervention because Americans would make a rational cost-benefit analysis and conclude that fighting a two-ocean war was economic suicide. Prince Konoe Fumimaro, who had been Prime Minister during the pact signing, had received reports from Ambassador Nomura Kichisaburo in Washington describing American factories beginning to retool for war production, but the Japanese leadership dismissed these as propaganda, not understanding that companies like General Motors would completely cease civilian production and manufacture millions of military vehicles and aircraft engines. At the Japanese embassy in Washington, Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurusu Saburo were still negotiating with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, completely unaware that American cryptographers had broken the Japanese Purple Diplomatic Code, and that President Roosevelt and his advisers were reading every cable between Tokyo and Washington in real time. The Japanese believed their negotiating strategy was brilliantly deceptive, not knowing that Roosevelt had told his cabinet on November 25th that an attack was likely within days. The roots of Japanese contempt for American fighting capability traced back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, when Japan had shocked the world by defeating a European power, with Admiral Togo Haihachiro destroying the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima. Theodore Roosevelt had mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth ending that war, and Japanese military observers interpreted American eagerness for peace as evidence of weakness rather than pragmatic balance of power politics. The Imperial Japanese Army's experience in China since 1937 had reinforced their belief in spiritual superiority over material advantage, as Japanese forces consistently defeated numerically superior Chinese armies through what they called seishin, spiritual power. General Araki Sadao, the former war minister, had written that the Japanese soldiers' willingness to die for the emperor made him worth 10 enemy soldiers, a calculation that would prove catastrophically wrong when tested against determined American forces. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur commanded a force of 130,000 Filipino and American troops, but Japanese intelligence correctly assessed that only approximately 31,000 were regular soldiers, while the rest were recently mobilized Filipino reservists with minimal training. What they failed to anticipate was that early defeats would forge an American determination for unconditional surrender that would accept nothing less than the complete destruction of Japanese military power. The Japanese Navy's officer corps, many of whom had studied abroad, were less contemptuous of American capabilities than their army counterparts. Admiral Yamamoto himself had spent 3 years as a naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1929, touring American factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh. Yet even Yamamoto believed that a decisive early victory would shock Americans into negotiation, not understanding that Pearl Harbor would unite American public opinion in unprecedented fury. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who would lead the first wave against Pearl Harbor, had spent months training his pilots over Kagoshima Bay, perfecting shallow-water torpedo runs that British swordfish biplanes had proven possible at Taranto. Fuchida knew Sunday morning meant minimal American readiness, with ships in port condition and anti-aircraft ammunition locked away, creating perfect conditions for maximum casualties. The cultural misunderstanding ran deep, with Japanese planners believing democracy was weakness, that congressional debate would paralyze response while Japan consolidated conquests in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They had observed bitter debates between interventionists and isolationists, and concluded American society was too fractured to mount effective resistance, not understanding that external attack would instantly unite these factions. At the Japanese Naval War College in Etajima, instructors taught that America's multi-ethnic society was inherently inferior to Japan's homogeneity. Captain Kuroshima Kameto, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, believed America's consumer society had created a generation psychologically unprepared for Pacific warfare's brutal conditions. The economic calculations were equally flawed. Japanese planners knew America's gross national product exceeded Japan's tenfold, but believed consumer economy couldn't convert to war production without collapse. They studied American labor strikes and concluded workers would never accept wartime regimentation, not foreseeing that those same unions would enforce no-strike pledges while factories operated continuously with women comprising much of the workforce. Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko, the emperor's uncle, had toured America in the 1920s and returned convinced Americans were addicted to comfort, describing how Americans required ice in drinks and used elevators rather than stairs. These observations shaped institutional memory and strategic planning, contributing to fatal assumptions about American resolve. The morning of December 7th at Pearl Harbor began with Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott detecting the incoming Japanese strike force at 0702 hours, 137 miles north of Oahu. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the duty officer, assumed it was expected B-17s from California and dismissed the warning. This perfect storm of Japanese preparation and American unpreparedness seemed to validate Japanese strategic thinking. The first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft achieved complete surprise at 0755 hours when Commander Fuchida transmitted Tora, Tora, Tora. Within minutes, torpedoes struck Battleship Row while dive bombers destroyed aircraft lined wing-to-wing on airfields. Admiral Nagumo's staff officers on carrier Akagi were euphoric as reports confirmed massive destruction with minimal resistance. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, something unprecedented occurred as recruiting stations were overwhelmed by volunteers. Marine Corps offices in New York processed more enlistments on December 8th than in the previous 6 months. In Texas, the army ran out of forms. In California, Japanese Americans enlisted despite knowing their families faced suspicion. The transformation of American industry began immediately. Automobile executives gathered in Detroit on December 9th, pledging complete conversion to military production. William Knudsen of General Motors asked colleagues what they needed, receiving universal response: "Just tell us what and when." Boeing's Seattle plant, producing 3 B-17s weekly, was told to reach one daily within 6 months, a goal exceeded by March 1942, eventually achieving 16 daily through continuous shifts. Henry Kaiser revolutionized shipbuilding by applying assembly line techniques, reducing Liberty ship construction from 244 days to 42 days, eventually launching complete cargo ships every 4 days. Japanese planners had calculated American capacity using traditional methods, not imagining Americans would train housewives to weld and build ships faster than enemies could sink them. The racial theories underpinning Japanese strategy shattered as American forces proved capable of exceeding Japanese combat effectiveness through superior logistics and tactics. Marines landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942 weren't the city boys Japanese propaganda described, but depression-hardened young men who adapted to jungle warfare with shocking effectiveness. General Horii Tomitaro, commanding in New Guinea, reported in September 1942 that American and Australian troops displayed unexpected tenacity, refusing surrender when surrounded and maintaining cohesion under conditions that should have caused collapse. His reports were dismissed as excuses, the High Command unable to accept their fundamental errors in judgment. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor as Yamamoto had warned, demonstrated the price of underestimating American capabilities. Operation MMI involved elaborate deception across thousands of miles, assuming Americans would react predictably. Instead, Commander Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had broken enough of the JN-25 code to determine the target was Midway. Admiral Nimitz risked his entire carrier force on intelligence estimates, positioning forces northeast of Midway for perfect ambush position. On June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, found empty ocean where Japanese carriers should have been. Running low on fuel, he spotted destroyer Arashi racing north and correctly deduced it was returning to the main force. At 10:22 hours, Lieutenant Richard Best released his bomb at 1,500 feet, penetrating Akagi's deck and exploding among fueled aircraft. Within minutes, 3 of 4 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor were burning beyond salvation. Captain Takayanagi, watching from destroyer Nowaki, later wrote it was inconceivable the Americans they had humiliated 6 months earlier could execute such devastating ambush. By November 1942, American production achieved seemingly impossible scales. Ford's Willow Run plant covered 3.5 million square feet, employing 42,000 workers, eventually producing B-24 bombers every 63 minutes at peak production. When Japanese intelligence received these reports through neutral sources, they dismissed them as propaganda. The Manhattan Project, building on research begun in 1939 and formally established in August 1942, eventually employed 130,000 workers and cost $2 billion, demonstrating organizational capability that contradicted Japanese beliefs about democratic inefficiency. Admiral Yamamoto was killed April 18, 1943, when American P-38s intercepted his transport over Bougainville, the mission requiring precise navigation over 435 miles based on decoded communications, demonstrating American superiority in intelligence and execution that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. American submarines sank over 1,300 Japanese vessels, totaling 5.3 million tons. The submarine war demonstrated American technical superiority and aggressive spirit Japanese planners believed impossible. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo exemplified aggressive tactics, sinking 19 ships before being lost with all hands. The island-hopping campaign demonstrated strategic flexibility Japanese defensive planning couldn't match. Rather than attacking every position, Americans bypassed strongholds, leaving them isolated while seizing less defended positions for next advances. This required inter-service cooperation Japanese planners believed impossible given American military rivalries. The Marine Corps expanded from 54,000 to approximately 485,000, developing amphibious doctrine that turned contested landings into systematic operations. Marines at Tarawa in November 1943, wading through chest-deep water under murderous fire and taking the island despite approximately 35% casualties, demonstrated will-matching samurai tradition. The B-29 Superfortress program created pressurized bombers flying at 30,000 feet with 20,000-pound loads for 3,250 miles. When B-29s appeared over Japan June 15, 1944, Japanese fighters couldn't reach their altitude, nor could anti-aircraft guns range them. General Curtis LeMay's switch from high-altitude precision to low-altitude incendiary attacks demonstrated adaptability Japanese doctrine couldn't match. The March 9 to 10, 1945 Tokyo firebombing killed approximately 100,000, proving American ruthlessness contradicted Japanese beliefs about Western sentimentality. Kamikaze attacks, beginning October 1944, achieved tactical successes, but strategically accelerated defeat by squandering irreplaceable pilots. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro believed Americans would be psychologically shattered by Japanese willingness to die. Not understanding Americans interpreted this as desperation justifying any response. Okinawa demonstrated Americans would accept casualties Japanese planners deemed politically impossible. Approximately 49,000 American casualties, including over 12,500 dead. The attrition strategy designed to make invasion unacceptable instead convinced American leaders invasion would cost millions, justifying atomic weapons. Hiroshima's atomic bombing August 6, 1945, delivered 15,000 tons TNT equivalent, destroying 69% of buildings and killing approximately 80,000 instantly. The Japanese High Command initially refused believing single bombs could cause such destruction. Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, August 15, 1945, cited the new and most cruel bomb, avoiding admission that Japanese strategic thinking had failed completely. Military officers attempting coup to prevent surrender represented final inability to accept defeat by those they had underestimated. General Tojo, who assured the Emperor America wouldn't fight prolonged war, attempted suicide when arrested September 8, 1945, but failed. At trial, he admitted, "We thought America was a nation of merchants who would not fight, but learned America could be the most fierce warriors." MacArthur's occupation transformed Japanese society more thoroughly in 7 years than Meiji Restoration in 40. Japanese watched amazed as Americans provided food, introduced democratic reforms, and rebuilt industry with technology enabling Japan's economic miracle. American mobilization transformed a nation with the world's 17th-ranked army in 1939 to dominant superpower by 1945. America produced 324,750 aircraft versus Japan's 76,320, built 2,710 Liberty Victory ships versus Japan's handful, manufactured 88,410 tanks versus Japan's 2,515. The fundamental error wasn't just underestimating industrial capacity, but misunderstanding psychology, believing a nation inventing jazz couldn't invent proximity fuses, that movie lovers couldn't master radar, that comfort seekers couldn't endure hardship when motivated by righteous anger. Individual stories contradicted every preconception. Lieutenant John Kennedy swimming 4 hours towing injured crewmen after PT-109 was cut in half. Doris Miller manning anti-aircraft gun at Pearl Harbor despite no training. Richard Bong downing 40 Japanese aircraft before dying testing jets. Navajo code talkers used their language as unbreakable code despite their people's historical grievances. The 442nd Regiment of Japanese Americans, whose families were interned, became America's most decorated unit with 21 Medals of Honor. Women transformed from housewives to welders, secretaries to pilots, contradicting Japanese gender assumptions so fundamentally that captured soldiers refused believing women built American weapons. The occupation demonstrated American genius beyond destruction. MacArthur introduced land reform, women's suffrage, democratic constitution while preventing starvation, proving organizational capability extending from warfare to reconstruction. Japanese military leaders who mocked Americans in December 1941 were by August 1945 dead, executed, or writing memoirs explaining their errors. Admiral Toyoda Sumu testified the greatest mistake was believing Americans would quit after early defeats. The transformation from isolationist democracy to superpower in 4 years demonstrated capabilities no Japanese planner imagined. The nation spending more on candy than defense in 1940 had by 1945 created history's most powerful military, conquered territory from Arctic to tropics, developed atomic weapons, established dominance lasting through the century. The lesson learned too late: American democracy wasn't weakness but strength, diversity wasn't chaos but creativity, materialism wasn't softness but foundation for industrial power, individualism enabled innovation hierarchical Japanese society couldn't match. The final irony: the America-Japan attacked, believing it too weak to fight, proved capable of not just defeating but transforming Japan into democratic ally, achieving through commerce what conquest failed to secure. Emperor Hirohito, after meeting MacArthur, admitted, "Everything we believed about Americans was wrong. They are neither weak nor cruel, but strong and generous, and we who thought ourselves superior proved inferior in every way that mattered."